are so lucky, grateful to have our very own Skip Halpern here with us to talk about his book, Wellsprings of Work. We're going to hear a lot more about the book tonight, but I'll just say to start us off that the book explores ideas of purpose and of legacy through this lens of work, but work that is hopefully, as we'll talk about, not soulless work, not just about the material gains of work, but that is something more. It's about asking broad questions about how we can make our lives meaningful. And Skip in the book uses a broad range of sources, some of which we'll hopefully hear about, and draws from his own experience in his very diverse life and career, from brushes with Buffett and Madoff, some of which went better than others, to Major League Baseball, working with Major League Baseball and the NHL and the Inupiat Eskimo population, and also features books and authors I'm almost certain he was first exposed to at Temple Micah, where he and his wife Barbara have been members for over 50 years. I hope you don't mind that I looked it up. I think you joined in 1970, so just over 50 years. I won't say much more because many of you might already know him, and if you don't know him, you can and should because he's around at Temple Micah. And so, with that, Skip, let's hop in.
Great.
The agenda for tonight, Skip and I are going to talk back and forth about the book. I have a number of questions that I'm going to ask for him, and then we'll have about 25 minutes at the end for questions, just so we can get as many questions in as possible. You can chat the questions to me. Just find my name, Stephanie Crawley. There shouldn't be a large list because I think I've set it up so that you can't chat to other people, so you'll have to find ways to communicate afterwards, not during, unless you want to talk to me. If you have questions that come up during, you're also welcome to send them to me, not just afterwards. So, Skip, we're going to start just with, after that little intro and another thank you, to please just start by telling us about the book.
Sure.
Beyond what we've seen that encouraged us to come tonight, what are the basic ideas of the book, and why did you write it now?
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining, and Rabbi Crawley for moderating. The basic ideas behind the book, I guess a little context or backstory is a good way to shoehorn into that. I retired from full-time employment several years ago, and I found myself shortly after that realizing there was something really gnawing at me. There was something on my mind and I couldn't put my finger on it. And after a while, I realized it was a series of questions along the lines of what did all that really amount to? What were the motivations that made me really interested in my work? And what were the values that guided it? And regardless of the answers, I realized I wanted to try to get at the sources that the answers came from. So I didn't plan to write a book initially. This is just reflecting for my own self and reassessment. And what I ended up coming up with was a series of ideas. They're now in the book. Broadly put, I'd say, focusing on how do you develop a sense of meaning or values in a secular capitalist society. And more narrowly, I came up with a perspective along the lines of what are psychologically and spiritually the sources of meaning and motivation, and in work specifically, values to guide it, and then given the audience here, false messiahs, you might say, siren songs along the way. And I wanted to get below the surface. I wanted to get at the underlying roots, which is why I called it Wellsprings, as opposed to just the surface manifestations. The subtitle of the book basically says it all. It's surprising sources of meaning and motivation in work. In terms of the structure of the book, it's largely built on a backbone of stories. And you're right. I mean, I concentrated largely over my career in some combination of investing and law and business, which a lot of people would consider soulless or value neutral or worse, I would say. But I found, as I dug into it through these stories, just reflecting on my own experiences, that there were I'd say impulses or drives that motivated me. And the more I got into it, I realized they apply to a lot of different types of occupations and endeavors, and to people, I'd say, of many ages, people just starting a career, mid-career, later. I mean, just to take one real brief example, you mentioned Warren Buffett. I had occasion to negotiate one-on-one with him, which is a whole backstory, but I won't go fully into it. We controlled a company that came out of bankruptcy, Kaiser Aluminum, and he wanted to buy control. And one day I spoke with him. A few days later, he called me, left me a message on my recording machine. Hi, Skip, this is Warren. It's 1 o'clock. Give me a call. And I saved that. And when I was working on the book, I thought, why did I think that was so cool? You know, just stopping there is not much of an answer. And the more I thought about it, and I thought about it a lot, and in stuff that I read, I saw that it was really just a basic sense of respect or validation. And that seems like a pretty lofty example, but I think respect or validation or recognition is a real powerful driver across the board. And we can get into some other examples. One of the perspectives that also was really driving me was trying to look upward. There's a book that some of you might know about. It was a pretty popular book written by a guy named David Graeber several years ago called Bullshit Jobs. And guess what its perspective was? It was about how the glass is half empty. And I thought it was time for a rejoinder to that, because I think that's only really half of the equation. And then the final thing is what I said about false messiahs or siren songs. A lot of hype, a lot of ego, a lot of myths that exploit workers. And I wanted to point out not just the smiley part of this subject, but the negative part as well.
Thank you. So obviously it was, you wrote the book when you wrote the book because it was relevant to your life.
Mm-hmm.
But as I think we'll get to in a little bit, the book also sort of anticipates some trends that come up. I wonder how, especially given, writing in response to Graeber's book, and otherwise, is this a timeless conversation, or is it timely?
Well, to be a wise guy, yes. I think it's both. I mean, clearly certain aspects of it are timeless. I stumbled across all sorts of things that struck me as relevant. One was a poem by a Greek poet, 1st century BC, Horace. And he wrote a poem, basically, without trying to recite it, about how he thought building a monument, a literal monument, would be a way for him to be timeless. And as I think about it, he said something about building this monument will make the greatest part of me escape the greedy claws of death, or something dramatic like that. And today, some wag referred to that sort of monument building as having an edifice complex, but it's for legacy. That's a timeless motivation. And I also refer to the German philosopher Otto Spengler, and he theorized something that's clearly timeless and universal. And I think it's very good insight that really at the heart of all civilization is the human awareness of mortality that drives everything from much of religion to all sorts of work, and works as a noun as well. But parts of it clearly were more timely. The COVID pandemic, clearly very topical, very timely. There's a management consulting and research firm called Gartner that some of you might know. And they, I thought, had a good spin on the supposed great resignation. They said it's a great rethink, and had a lot of survey data to back up the notion that many people during the pandemic especially were very focused on rethinking and reassessing and looking for purpose, value, however you want to phrase it, in their jobs. Another very topical trend is there are business schools today that are really, for the first time, beginning to focus on the limitations of capitalism and how the profit bottom line, the Milton Friedman school, sort of squeezes out all other values besides financial values, and how remorseless it is. And I think a lot of people under that wheel are particularly discontented today. I think continued automation, artificial intelligence, make people feel like cogs in a wheel. I think there are many examples of this: process as opposed to purpose, process as opposed to substance. It's sort of a phenomenon throughout our society. One example, for those who are lawyers or had exposure to legal business, is the adversary system. It's just the process, regardless of what side you're on, two combatants supposed to argue, that produces a result, but it's a process-driven thing. And I read just recently, a couple of months ago, I read a comment by Malcolm Gladwell, the essayist, and he said, I thought this was very good, it's hard to find somebody who's good at a job and doesn't like it, except maybe for lawyers. And I think this emphasis on process is part of the support for that conclusion. So I'd say that there are a whole lot of pressures that make finding work meaningful and purposeful particularly difficult today, but people increasingly crave it as well. So that's the timely aspect.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've sort of hinted at where I wanted to go next, which is on this idea that work, particularly now, has sort of negative connotations.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that the business schools are having to shift how they have changed it, what has come up in the great rethink. So one is like, you've talked a little bit about the negatives, add more if there's anything there, but how would you, if you could define work, how would you like to define it?
Well, in terms of the negatives, yeah, Graeber really made the case in his definition of a bullshit job is a job that's pointless or useless, and the person doing the job feels the pointlessness and the uselessness. And he claims that across North America and Western Europe, something like 40% of people feel that. And I just thought that was overplaying his hand. Having said that, a friend of mine who's a very clever, funny guy read the book, had a lot of nice things to say to me, but he's in retirement. He's looking about relaxation, and he said, you need to change the title of the book to Bed Springs of Rest. And so the negative aspect of work is that it's demanding. And that, I think, was his point. Another negative aspect is that frequently people sing the praises of work, and it's just to exploit workers, just make them feel good. Defining it broadly is how I define it. So I'm talking about work, and I mentioned this early on, not only the obvious aspect where it's a paid occupation, but it could be a serious pursuit of a hobby or some avocation. It could be volunteering. It's any, as I tried to explore it in the book, it's any sort of serious ongoing pursuit. And it's not Mark Twain's definition. He said work is anything a body is obliged to do, and play is anything a body is not obliged to do. But as I explained, and there's a chapter on this, I think for many people, at least in certain instances, play and work merge. A lot of people really enjoy what they do. And you mentioned Bernie Madoff. I had occasion to deal with and fortunately avoid investing in his fund. And it was like, I know the process I went through and we went through, it wasn't me alone, it was very competitive. And it was like playing in a game, because every time a problem popped up and we tried to get an answer, two more problems would pop up. And it was like an ongoing mental arm wrestling match. And there was a sense of competition or play in that. And I think a lot of people feel that, even though sometimes it's clearly a negative.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like what you're saying, which I think I appreciate, is for a person to find their work meaningful, they have to be able to consider themselves as more than a worker in the work context. Because a worker is one who can be exploited for profit.
Yeah, there's a just a classic book, and a lot of people might have on this call might have read it or at least heard of it. And there are a lot of Chicagoans in Temple, Micah. Studs Terkel, a very impressive journalist out of Chicago, wrote a book called Working. And he surveyed a wide range of workers. I mean, everything from parking lot attendants to stockbrokers to professional athletes. And he points out in the introduction that a huge part of what he has found redeeming in the work that he has done is a degree of creative freedom. If you can start something and bring it all the way through, if you can start something and have some influence on what the thing is and how it's created and some of the nuances of it. And an example to the contrary, which is in the book, is, and I dealt a lot with auto workers. A lot of auto workers, very, very disenchanted because it's the classic assembly line where you are just a cog in the wheel. And that can be dispiriting.
So there's creativity as a way that makes work meaningful beyond a paycheck or a measurement of productivity. What else? Like what are other ways to make work meaningful? What are those drivers or those sources of motivation for work?
Well, I'll tell you one very brief story, which I found it was probably the first one to come to mind as I was trying to think of ways to convey some of these ideas. And it dealt with auto workers. We had occasion to get involved when Ford Motor Company and the United Auto Workers had a dispute. The company said under the collective bargaining agreement, we agreed to pay money for retiree health only during the term of the agreement. And the union said, no, 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 you agreed to pay contributions for the lifetime of the retirees. So they had a big dispute. They settled it. They ended up with Ford agreeing to contribute a bunch of, it's like a stock with an option built in. It's called a warrant into a retiree medical fund. And we were in charge of it. Long story short, when the warrants were contributed, they were literally worthless. But over time, for various reasons I won't get into, they became very, very valuable. And we ended up selling them for $1.8 billion. And that was immensely gratifying to me. And I thought a lot about why. And so what made that work, that project, meaningful. And it was a whole host of impulses that I realized were operating in my mind, in my heart, that I got into in more detail later in the book. One was just the David versus Goliath playing competition aspect, because we were a small group, my firm and the team working on this, against the Goliath of Ford Motor Company. So that was a play and competition idea. Another was the alignment of personal values with what I thought was a great social good. Another was a real tricky kind of two-headed idea, which we can talk about later. On the one hand, it was very prestigious. I felt very proud. And simultaneously, I felt very humbled by it, because this thing was so much bigger than me personally, and we had a huge team working on it with outside advisors and so forth. So it was simultaneously big on ego and really small on ego. And I think that odd pair frequently operates. And then there was an aspect of duty or civic responsibility, because it was about 200,000 auto workers who were at issue. So I felt a real obligation. I think those are some examples of what can make work meaningful.
Thank you. Yeah. I just want to, before we move on, I want to give folks the chance to just see what's in the book, so that you can get a sense of the table of contents and sort of the different things, because we won't be able to get to all of it tonight. But just the working for purpose and meaning, personal values, working towards that. I think what you just said about being assertive and yet part of something larger. And then, we'll talk next. I have a question for us about Judaism, and I'm curious. I have particular questions, but I'm curious about this productivity for God, for self and God, to talk more about that, and other things. So that's so this is our table of contents, just for folks to get an idea, and to maybe whet some appetites if folks are interested in reading after tonight, and send that. To shift gears a little bit, let's talk about Judaism. You're a member of Temple Micah. Things that pop up in the book, I definitely know are on my bookshelf, because, they're on Rabbi Danny Zemel's bookshelf. And many years ago, he said these are the books that all rabbis need to read, and clearly all people. And but the Jewish conversation about work is actually much older than that. Our sort of first mention of work is right when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, that the life of leisure is gone, and
Right.
that Adam has to till the soil and keep the land, and that's work. That's when work begins. Work begins as soon as we are out of the idyllic sort of pre-creation creation. But it's picked up on later, is that work is talked about very positively in a lot of Jewish texts, but it has to be combined with the active spiritual or scholarly life.
Right.
So in Pirkei Avot, I know some of you have studied Pirkei Avot with me, with our rabbis, so we got to that, is that we're taught, one, Shammai says to love work, but hate acting the superior, and don't attempt to draw near to the ruling authority. That's one really interesting text on work. And that's in Pirkei Avot chapter 1. Pirkei Avot chapter 2 has Rabban Gamliel saying, excellent is the study of Torah when combined with a worldly occupation, such as a labor, a craft, or a trade. So I'm curious, just with this sort of in your mind, like, does that cohere with what you gleaned from your stories, your assumptions about Jewish concepts of work?
Yes, and with a few refinements or elaborations. You brought to my attention, because I didn't know these texts, Shammai and Gamliel, and my sort of bumper sticker understanding of Shammai was don't brag and love what you're doing. And the don't brag part made me think of something I certainly had focused on, which was in Ecclesiastes, for example, which I mentioned in the book, the very famous passage about vanity, vanity, a man toils and generations come and go. I mean, that is clearly a very humbling, depressant on ego kind of perspective. And actually, I mentioned that's not unique to Judaism for sure. There's a lot of Buddhist and Hindu thought in terms of karma yoga about working selflessly and what that means, with a lot of refinement. But I also thought of the guy who used to head Bear Stearns, late great broker dealer, Alan Greenberg, who was a very charismatic, hardworking, no nonsense, funny guy, and he warned all the huge egos at that company beware when you start thinking your sweat smells like perfume. And it was the opposite of ego. The love work part, there were a lot of things in the Tanakh that occurred to me, very consistent with that, I think. Everything from Deuteronomy to Exodus and Leviticus and the Psalms and Proverbs, about the value of hard work. And Heschel actually says we are as commanded to work as we are to rest. So I think there's plenty in the Jewish literature. In terms of what I understood, what you brought to my attention about Gamliel, I mean, I totally agree that there needs to be a balance. And workism, which I talk about in the book, is basically the notion of living to work as opposed to working to live. And it's sort of an approach to work that just sucks up everything and overshadows all other pursuits or forms of value, you know, whether it's your family or it's your friends or it's your religion or your spirituality. But I think there is also, and I touched on this earlier, referring to Koestler, I think there's also the possibility to find spirituality through your work. And there's a discussion in the book of an example of that, where I dealt with the Chinese government and talk about big, feeling like you're connected to something larger. So I simultaneously did feel ego. I felt proud, but I also felt really humbled again by connecting with 1.4 billion people dealing with their retirement system. And that I think is not necessarily a dichotomy between work and spirituality, or you might say the practical material world and the spiritual world. In some cases, I think the two kind of merge also. And Einstein, I remember Einstein also, he famously said that the impulse behind scientific research is the cosmic religious sense. And he said that physicists seek to draw his lines after him. So in his pursuit of physics, he saw a great, I'd say, fusion between the hard science on the one hand and his sense of this cosmic religious force as well.
Right. Yeah. To use Heschel's language, there's, life cannot be all work, but it also cannot be all Shabbat. But one of the things that Shabbat, which is the placeholder for the spiritual life in this way, gives us is a language, I would say, to understand I'm experiencing something so much larger than myself.
Right.
And, oh, that's awe. I actually have language or have experience from another realm of my life to understand that experience. And without that, I think that's where it all becomes ego.
Yeah.
I'm not feeling awe, I'm feeling awesome.
Right. Yeah. And he also makes the point, which was, I thought, a really interesting thing for me, talking about how work is in the realm of time and Shabbat is in the realm of the timeless. Mm-hmm. And having a sense of both of those is a very healthy kind of way to live your life.
I want to get to this question. So before we open it up, speaking of timeless and thinking about Shabbat, when one enters a phase that is very, very far off for me, I'll say, but when one enters a phase where time has looser bounds, like retirement or otherwise, how does someone make meaning? Like, how can these ideas of work exist past into retirement? This obviously, you went back to work after retirement. You wrote a book, but this idea of how can work extend beyond a career or beyond a sense of productivity, and what wellsprings do you think are available to people who do not or who no longer have a job in that
Yeah,
way?
yeah. I think the basic answer, well, the basic answer is severalfold. First, I deliberately, as I said earlier, defined work very broadly. So it's not just paid compensation. It's applying yourself to anything in a serious way, an avocation or hobby, volunteering. Secondly, I thought a lot about baby boomers because I'm one of them. And a lot of people on this Zoom session fit that category. And, you know, the statistic is there are over 70 million Americans now. It's like something approaching 10,000 retirements a day. It's mind-boggling, the size of this gray wave. So I think it's a critical question. I think one obvious and particularly applicable to retired people or people approaching retirement, which I felt personally, is this notion of legacy. It's the notion, and it's very deep human emotion. You want to leave a mark. And you referred to bookshelves at MICA and particular books that Danny has on his bookshelf. One of them greatly influenced me, and it's called The Ethics of Memory. I mentioned to you when we were talking about this session that you had cited that in one of your sermons, and it really struck a chord with me. And Margalit makes the point that what is most disturbing about the idea of death is falling into oblivion, meaning that your time on earth was so inconsequential that you are not remembered. And you didn't leave a mark that's worth remembering. And I think this notion of legacy is very tied to that. And I think it's a powerful impulse. I think people who are younger certainly have some sense of it, but I think part of aging is reckoning with that. And there are more or less, in my view, healthy ways of manifesting that. I think it's different than another answer to your question, which is building for the future. I think as you age, you have an increasing reckoning with the notion that the world is going to hum right along long after you're gone. So you think about your kids, you think about your grandchildren, and you probably think in broader terms about humanity overall. And there was another piece. I don't know whether, I think I mentioned it in a discussion group at MICA right after I had read it by a NYU philosopher named Samuel Scheffler. And he hypothesizes the impact on people of all ages if they imagined the world was coming to an end in 30 days. And that would just kick the legs out from a lot of motivation for a lot of people, you know, whether you're doing research or you're building a bridge or you're arguing a lawsuit, you're painting a painting. If you're not going to be around in 30 days, why continue? So this notion of building for the future, I think, can be a great motivator for a lot of people, particularly as you get older.
Absolutely. I think the flip side of that is if you're younger, I hear amongst a lot of my peers, well, climate change is going to destroy our planet before I get, while my children are still going to live. So I'm not going to have children. There's no point in me thinking about planning for the future
Right.
because, we've been, that fate has been sealed for a long time. I live a little bit more in a space of hope.
Yeah.
And even things like a great example of this is I have a student who at one point was telling me about thinking about going back to get a third master's degree. And she essentially said to me, I'm not concerned about taking on more student debt because I just assume that the whole thing will crash before I have to pay it off. And she meant everything that she understands is that the economic situation as exists will not exist for long enough for her to have to pay off her student loans, which would mean bad things for a lot of people. I wouldn't mind not having student debt either, but I think I won't quite make it there. But when you're looking forward and it feels really hard to plan for the future, it's longer than 30 days, of course, but 30 years, 100 years out, like what's the recommendation for people who are looking forwards and not looking backward?
Well, I think climate change is an extremely good example. And one thing I wanted to mention along just those lines, I've thought about the difference between what we talked about a moment ago, legacy versus building for the future. And I'm a big professional tennis fan for a variety of reasons. And I ran across a quote from a guy who other tennis geeks might have heard of 50 years ago, Guillermo Vilas. He was an Argentinian tennis player. And he said, legacy is when after you've won one big tournament, you want to win another one. And after you win two, you want three. And after the third one, you want them to build a statue of you downtown in Buenos Aires. But building for the future, and I flagged this page, something Jerry Brown, former California governor, mentioned when he got a cap and trade system, carbon cap and trade system in place for California. He explained, and I'm quoting him, "This isn't about some cockamamie legacy. This isn't for me. I'm going to be dead. It's for you, and it's damn real." So I think the idea of near-term future and further future, can both be very animating. And a lot of people who are interested in climate change, whether you're a journalist or you're an oceanographer or you're a meteorologist, whatever, are very motivated by this notion of their future, but also the future of their future families and maybe even humanity broadly.
Certainly. And that's where Judaism leads us, right? I've taught this story a few times, I think actually in the sermon that you referenced, about what to do if the Messiah comes and you're planting a tree and someone comes up to you and says, the Messiah is here. You keep planting the tree and then you go see the Messiah. And, if the Messiah is there, great. But that we don't actually stop the building for the future, even when the future has arrived, I think. Is a beautiful Jewish idea. And I think it's harder and harder for folks to do that planting, for young folks to do that planting. I think
that can be very disillusioned, disenchanted.
Well, this has been great. We're going to keep going, but I have more questions for Skip, but I also guess that many of you have questions because you're here tonight. So I'm going to invite folks to put some questions in the chat. To enhance and expand our conversation tonight. You can send them, like I said, to me, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So let's take like 30 seconds for people to lean forward and type in the chat their questions, and then we'll restart the conversation. Great, thanks. From Marcia Semmel, do you feel that people's identity becomes fractured because they need to seek purpose outside of work? No, that's a great question.
I suppose so. I mean, there are all the slogans, all the very common phrases about seeking work-life balance, as if work is separate from life and even perhaps antagonistic to life. And I think that's a real serious problem. I know one approach that I found myself taking was trying to understand the ways your work and your life can be mutually reinforcing as opposed to antagonistic regarding one and the other. And some of these underlying psychological or spiritual drives that we've been talking about tonight, to the extent I think it's not kidding yourself to recognize those in your work and try to nurture them, it can perhaps help with that fusion of your work and your life. And again, it's like a lot of things in life. It's a balance, because I think some people drink too much of this Kool-Aid, and they think their work is the be all end all, and it crowds out an awful lot of purpose and value as well. The one other thing I'll say is I think there are all types of work that amount to virtue signaling, maybe people trying to convince themselves that they've been able to successfully get more purpose into their work. And the current example is in the ESG movement, which I have dealt with a lot, environmental, social, governance criteria to influence your investment decisions. So-called greenwashing, where companies, for example, and investors claim that a company is really responsible and doing great things for the environment, but it's largely hyped. And so I think that sort of thing can be kind of insidious and convince you that you've successfully brought your work and your values together when a lot of it is just hyped up.
You and I talked about this show from Apple TV, if any of you all have seen it, Severance, which is this idea that you can they do some surgery in your brain and you're a different person at work than you are at home, and you don't remember either identity. And it allows you, I think it's such an interesting metaphor, and it speaks to what you're saying, because one of the things that creating that separation does is that it allows the people while they're working to not question the morality of the work that they're doing. And so this fractured identity that I think, Marcia, you're asking about, I wonder, Skip, about the need for the work and the life to be integrated so that you can make sure that you are a person of integrity at work in particular.
Well, that's an ideal. It's very, very hard in the real world to achieve it. Although I think some people, to some degree, frequently, although not always, do achieve it. There's one example, and it sounds mundane, but I think it's on point. There was a woman who was a victim of human trafficking who became a flight attendant at American Airlines. And I read an article about her maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And she has put, and American Airlines, apparently, as a matter of corporate policy, has put a big emphasis on trying to spot this on their planes. And she in particular has been very involved in this part of the American Airlines program. And so that is, in my mind, that's a great example of someone who feels, because of their personal history, very strongly about a certain social issue or a certain moral value, and they're able to integrate it into their job. In fact, their job facilitates their pursuit of something they think is important.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great example. Another question from Jan Gordon. As a public servant in my career, it was critical to me that the people I worked for sustained a purpose. How key is it, I'm gonna insert in here, in terms of finding meaningful work or sustaining that, or building building that sustained purpose, to find the right team, the right coworkers?
That strikes me as a real big issue. Several examples leap to mind, some more hokey than others, but I remember we had a poster on our wall that said there is, and it was a group, I think, in a shell rowing, and it was something like, there is no I in team. And the idea is, I think you can get great value through the esprit de corps, through working with other people who are working for the same sort of purpose. And citing Margalit again, another big takeaway, in my mind at least, from what he wrote, very much relates to this, and it's teamwork, but in the sense of being part of a guild, or perhaps a particular association. He cites being a fireman in the NYPD after going through 9/11, and this notion of being part of a collective where you as an individual realize you will not live forever, but the collective will continue after you're gone, and taking great solace from the fact that even if you're not remembered, the work you did contributed to the work of this larger team or this larger fraternity. And that struck me as a real powerful thought. And I think it gets to the psychology of many things, including people who are big sports fans. It gets to the root of a lot of, I think, tribal and nationalism. But I think it also relates to feeling like you're part of a team with a purpose that perhaps will continue its work after you're gone.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about that in terms of another conversation you and I had in preparation about thinking about things, trying to shift the question about legacy, which feels very big and very daunting, into this idea of what are my micro legacies?
Mm-hmm.
You know, oh, my coworkers remember me positively. I helped them. I
Yeah.
wonder if there are more things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just being remembered on an individual level. That's obviously very, very, very important. I think, and there was one example I bumped into. I must have had this on the brain because I kept seeing this everywhere along those lines. We have a hot tub that we put in place in our backyard several years ago, and the guy who oversaw the pouring of the concrete form that the hot tub sits on was really proud of what he did, because I noticed weeks after this had dried, he had written his initials in the concrete, BHC. And it made me think of a painter writing his or her initials in the bottom right corner of a canvas. And it seemed like the same impulse as a lawyer who has a reported case where the court writes an opinion and the name of the lawyer is there forever. It's legacy, but they seem to be different examples of the same kind of impulse, wanting to be remembered, either personally or for some larger cause.
Yeah. So back to you and your legacy then. How's the book being used? How's it being received?
Yeah, thanks for asking. There are, I'd say, two levels to that. One is on a personal level, individual readers who've read it, but the other is institutionally how it's being used. And on the personal level, I'm really happy with most of the comments I'm aware of are on the Amazon website. That's where most of the books have been sold. And people talking about how they're of different ages. The age of many of the people on this call down to people who apparently are in college and people in between. So that's gratifying. People who mention different lines of work they're in, whether it's IT or law, retired business or salespeople. That's been gratifying. People who like the stories, they think that helps convey the ideas and bring it all alive. That's good. Institutionally, I really wanted to try to get some of these ideas more promoted at schools, graduate schools and undergraduate schools. NYU's School of Business, the Stern School, is now using it with their students in a program called Business and Society, which gets at exactly these kinds of issues. I graduated from the law school here at GW, and they've been using it in career counseling. And I spent a year in London at the London School of Economics, and they're using it in a program which I really get a kick out of. It's called What I Know Now. And it's for students and recent alumni. So all of that is great. And I hope it get out there more into the schools as time goes by.
That's great to know. I hope that it's helping people navigate exactly questions like our next question,
Yeah.
which comes from Tina. It says, it's one thing if you're a teacher or rabbi. I totally hear you. I feel very lucky to be in the work that I am because as much as I also go to meetings all day, just like everybody else, that there is an inherent sort of spiritual purpose in what I'm doing. So it says it's one thing if you're a teacher or a rabbi to find spiritual purpose in work, but what about capitalism, mentioned from the start, which squeezes labor for profit? How can an employee find purpose in work, especially when the work schedule these days is often 24/7? What is, or is there, a workaround for that system?
Yeah, I mean, the reality, I think, is that those conditions, and I'm just jotting down a note on this, those conditions honestly make it very, very tough. I mean, Graeber's perspective, I think, is very legitimate. There are a lot of bullshit jobs out there, and that's just the reality. And a lot of wishful thinking is not going to change it. A lot of self-glorification. Gee, I'm doing only this, but it's got this great value to it, is not really going to change the situation. But on the other hand, I do think of one example from the Turkel's book that I mentioned, Working, that I think is a terrific example. He interviewed, and each one of these interviews is like 3 or 4, 2 or 3 pages long. He interviewed a waitress, and she talked about how what motivates her is a sense of pride in what she's doing. And there was one particular exchange where she told Studs Terkel, there was a guy who said to me, a customer who said to me, "You don't have to smile, I'm still going to give you a tip." And she was outraged. She said, "I don't do this for a tip. A tip is throwing me a bone. I basically do it because I want to do the job right." And he's got other examples of people in either blue collar or labor oriented type jobs who just take a lot of pride in what they do. And I mean, it's genuine satisfaction. On the other hand, that might be 3 hands now. I think that can be very hyped. There's a very notable quote that I just stumbled into a couple of months ago, long after I had finished, many months after I finished the book, from Martin Luther King. And it basically said, if your lot in life is to be a street sweeper, sweep the street like Michelangelo painted and like Beethoven wrote symphonies. And my reaction is, yeah, I get the sentiment, but I don't think that that's a bridge too far in my mind. I think there's a lot of kidding yourself to try to get over the evils of capitalism. And the fact of the matter is, it's a system, especially in this country, I think, where a lot of other values are just squeezed out. They are, it's a fact. And maybe influencing business schools in particular to produce people who think about the system a little differently can maybe, round off some of those edges over time. But it's very incremental. And last thing that occurs to me, once I get started on this, I have a hard time stopping, is, and I mentioned this to Stephanie just before we started, there is a writer, I think she's with UNC, and she referred to MBA programs today are not your grandfather's MBA. And she said a lot of business schools are offering courses now that amount to what she called divinity school for capitalists, where they're trying to get at questions just like this to influence next generations of business leaders.
In that same vein, because I think for a long time, this is our next question. I didn't come up with this, but effective altruism has been a big school of thought for
Right.
business schools. The Singer sort of theory of ethics and otherwise. Should that be what we're teaching? Has it been debunked? Is that worthy of lifting or moving on from?
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of things. Sincerely, genuinely applied. I personally find it to be quite convincing and socially beneficial. Insincerely or superficially applied, it can be tremendously abused. And I mean, today's example, the example du jour is this guy with FTX, Samuel Bankman-Fried, who has probably pushed the idea back centuries now, as opposed to pushing it forward, because the way he ran his firm is just so abusive. I do touch on that in the book, and Peter Singer, the philosopher from Yale, who you mentioned, has a real good example of it, through which I found convincing. A particular guy who struggled with that and decided that getting a high-paid job at the World Bank could actually end up influencing more people for good than if he had a job with less, call it leverage, than the World Bank programs that he worked on, which had a tremendous impact on many, many people. So it's the notion of scale. And I think effective altruism can either produce what Singer calls warm glow altruism, where you feel really good about it, but you're not having much effect, or effective altruism, where in some cases you genuinely can have a large scale beneficial impact.
Yeah, thank you. I think trying to avoid the warm glow can be about our own work, but needs to be expansive beyond that. We're going to wrap up in just a second. I want to give you 30 more seconds to add or throw in anything else you'd like the folks on the call to know or hear, and then I'll thank you one more time, and then we'll say goodnight.
Okay. Well, I'll mention just one other thing. You had touched on it in passing, and it's the notion of hard work and reliability, and that's largely attributable to the so-called Protestant ethic.
Mhm.
But I try to point out it's not only Protestant, it's also a Jewish ethic, and it's actually a Hindu ethic also. But it too can be abused. The idea of having honest weights and measured from Leviticus. Does that mean that a drug dealer measuring honestly the heroin that he's selling is doing good work? So these things tend to be double-edged swords, just like your question about effective altruism. So it's potentially good stuff, and it's potentially not so good stuff, depending how it's handled.
I was trying to give you an answer to that question, as one interpretation of why when we say tzedek tirdov, justice you should pursue, right? This is fairly known is why is justice repeated twice, is that you have to do justice through just means. So if you're doing injustice, but you're doing it through just means, it still doesn't quite count, in the same way that if you're doing justice through unjust means, it doesn't entirely count. So I think
example.
The heroin dealer maybe is doing injustice justly.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
But the goal is to have both. So I will just end with a big thank you for sharing your work with us tonight, which was really you're sharing your life with us in so many ways tonight, in the way the book. I really enjoyed the book. I want to close with the thank you, and also by reading your own words back at you, because I think they well sum up what we're all trying to do, and even what at MICA we call the human project, which is this thing that we're all trying to be part of to make our lives meaningful, and worth something for something more. And you wrote, writing a poem, building a pyramid, joining a cause, supporting your family, rooting for your team, fighting for your nation, praying for an afterlife, serving others. In all cases, consciously or not, we seek something beyond our transient, limited selves, something more universal and enduring. So thank you for reminding us of the many paths towards doing that, and for sharing. And yeah, we'll all see each other soon. Be well, everyone. Thank you, Skip.
Thanks so much, all. Good night.